Imagine standing at the edge of a mist-covered valley, surrounded by towering cliffs that have hidden a secret for centuries. Deep within these remote corners of the world, entire kingdoms once flourished, untouched by outsiders, convinced they were the last of humankind. Their stories are not just tales of isolation, but of astonishing ambition, ingenuity, and ultimately, mystery. What happens when a civilization cuts itself off from the rest of the world? How does it survive, thrive, and then suddenly vanish, leaving behind only whispers in the wind? Today, we're diving into the dramatic rise and collapse of history's most isolated kingdoms, where the line between legend and reality blurs, and the echoes of these forgotten worlds still linger. From the dizzying heights of the Himalayas to the uncharted islands of the Pacific, these societies built empires in places so remote, they might as well have been on another planet. They crafted unique cultures, developed technologies tailored to their harsh environments, and even believed they were the sole survivors of some long-forgotten catastrophe. But then, against all odds, they disappeared, sometimes gradually, sometimes overnight. Was it climate change, internal strife, or something even more inexplicable? The clues are scattered like puzzle pieces across ruins, oral traditions, and the occasional baffling artifact. And as we piece them together, we uncover not just their stories, but a mirror held up to our own modern world. This isn't just a journey through time, it's an exploration of human resilience and fragility. These kingdoms remind us that even the most powerful societies are shaped by their surroundings, and that isolation can be both a shield and a trap. As we unravel their secrets, you'll find yourself asking, could this happen again? Are there lessons hidden in their ruins that we've overlooked? By the end, you'll see these vanished civilizations not as distant curiosities, but as hauntingly familiar echoes of our own struggles and triumphs. So let's step into the shadows of history and uncover the truths behind these enigmatic worlds. The story begins now. Isolation has always been a double-edged sword in human history. On one hand, it can act as a fortress protecting traditions, preserving unique ways of life, and even allowing societies to develop without outside interference. The Inca Empire mastered this, turning the jagged peaks of the Andes into both a shield and a throne. Their roads, their terraced farms, their stone cities, all were designed to thrive in a world that few outsiders could even reach. But isolation isn't just walls of rock or vast oceans. It's a mindset, a deliberate decision to turn inward. Some kingdoms, like Japan during its Sakoku period, closed their borders not out of fear, but from a calculated belief that outside influence would dilute their identity. Yet for every civilization that wielded isolation as a tool, there were others who found it thrust upon them. The Rapa Nui of Easter Island, surrounded by endless ocean, had no choice but to adapt or perish. Their story is a stark reminder that isolation can become a prison just as easily as a sanctuary. Without new ideas, without trade, without the genetic diversity that comes from mingling with others, societies can stagnate, or worse, collapse under their own weight. When European ships finally appeared on the horizon, many of these isolated peoples faced devastation not from swords or guns, but from diseases their bodies had never learned to fight. What makes these stories so compelling is how they mirror our own modern dilemmas. In an age where technology connects us instantly, we still grapple with the same questions: how much outside influence is too much? When does protection become paranoia? The lessons of these vanished kingdoms whisper to us across time, warning that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or resilient, can survive forever in a bubble. Their ruins stand as monuments to a simple truth. Isolation might buy time, but adaptation is the only currency that lasts. High in the Himalayas, where the air grows thin and the mountains seem to touch the sky, lies the forgotten kingdom of Mustang. For centuries, it was a jewel of the Silk Road, a bustling hub where caravans of traders, monks, and explorers paused to rest beneath its towering red cliffs. The people of Mustang didn't just survive in this harsh landscape, they mastered it. They carved entire cities into the rock, creating labyrinthine cave systems that served as homes, temples, and fortresses. Their monasteries clung to the cliffsides like nests, filled with ancient manuscripts and vibrant murals that whispered of a culture both sophisticated and resilient. But Mustang's strength was also its vulnerability. The kingdom's entire existence depended on one thing: the flow of trade along the Silk Road. When those routes shifted, when merchants found faster paths or safer passages, Mustang's lifeblood began to drain away. By the 18th century, the bustling markets fell silent, the caves emptied, the monasteries, once vibrant with chanting monks, stood like sentinels over a vanishing world. The kingdom didn't fall to war or disaster, it simply faded like a fire starved of oxygen. What makes Mustang's story so haunting isn't just its decline, but how ordinary it was. This wasn't a dramatic collapse, no invading armies, no erupting volcanoes. It was a slow unraveling, the kind that happens when a society puts all its faith in a single pillar. Without trade, the kingdom had no way to adapt. Its people, so ingenious in their mountain fortresses, had built a civilization perfectly suited to one reality and utterly unprepared for another. Today, the ruins of Mustang offer a quiet warning. In a world where economies rise and fall on the whims of global markets, where entire industries can vanish overnight, their story feels uncomfortably familiar. The cliffs still stand, the caves still echo, but the kingdom is gone. Not because it failed, but because it couldn't imagine a future beyond the trade routes that once defined it. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest threat to a civilization isn't the sudden blow, but the slow, creeping certainty that nothing will ever change. Imagine an island paradise where frescoes of leaping dolphins adorned palace walls, where labyrinthine corridors hid secrets of a thriving civilization, and where ships laden with treasures sailed across the Mediterranean. This was Crete at the height of the Minon civilization, a society so advanced, so vibrant, it seemed untouchable. Nestled in the heart of the Aegean, the Minoans didn't just survive in isolation, they turned it into an advantage. With no powerful neighbors to threaten them, they became masters of the sea, their ships weaving a web of trade that stretched from Egypt to the Greek mainland. Their palaces, like Knossos with its sprawling courtyards and intricate plumbing, were feats of engineering unmatched in their time. But what truly set the Minoans apart was their art. Every vase, every fresco, every delicate golden pendant pulsed with life-whirling dancers, sinuous octopuses, bulls mid-leap. This wasn't just decoration. It was a reflection of a society that celebrated beauty, movement, and the natural world. Even their writing, the still undeciphered Linear A, hints at a bureaucratic sophistication rivaling Egypt's. For centuries they flourished, their isolation acting as both a shield and a catalyst for innovation. Then, around 1450 BCE, the unthinkable happened. The palaces burned, the vibrant frescoes crumbled, the ships stopped sailing. The Minoans, who had seemed so invincible, vanished from history almost overnight. For years, scholars pointed to the cataclysmic eruption of Thera, a volcanic island 70 miles north of Crete, as the culprit. the explosion would have been heard across continents, its ash blighting crops, its tsunamis swallowing coastal cities. But newer research suggests the truth might be more complicated. Thara erupted decades before the Minon collapse, enough time for them to rebuild. So if not the volcano, then what? Some argue it was invasion, perhaps by the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, who left their own mark on Crete's ruins. Others point to internal decay, a society so dependent on trade that when disruptions came, their economy unraveled. The most haunting theory, that the Minoans' greatest strength became their fatal flaw. Their isolation had protected them for so long, they never developed the defenses or the flexibility to withstand a changing world. The Minoans' legacy lingers not just in their ruins, but in the questions they leave behind. How does a civilization so advanced, so attuned to its environment, simply disappear? Their story is a reminder that no kingdom, no matter how brilliant, is immune to the tides of history. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all: prosperity is fragile, and even the most isolated paradise can't escape time's relentless march. Picture this: a tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific, so remote that its nearest neighbors are over 1,000 miles away. This is Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island, where hundreds of massive stone figures stare blankly across an empty landscape. These moai aren't just sculptures, they're the last witnesses to a society that once thrived in isolation, only to crumble under the weight of its own ambition. The story of Rapa Nui begins with triumph. Around 1200 AD, Polynesian voyagers navigated thousands of miles of open ocean to settle this untouched paradise. They brought breadfruit, sweet potatoes, and chickens, everything needed to build a self-sufficient world. And build they did. The island's volcanic rock became the canvas for their ingenuity, transformed into towering statues that honored ancestors and chiefs. At its peak, Rapa Nui's population may have reached 15,000, a staggering number for an island only 63 square miles in size. The moai weren't just art, they were a testament to what unity and resourcefulness could achieve. But then the cracks began to show. To move these colossal statues, the Rapa Nui relied on wooden sledges and rollers, requiring vast amounts of timber. Slowly, the island's once lush palm forests vanished. Without trees, the soil eroded, crops failed, canoes couldn't be built, cutting off access to fishing grounds and trade. Society fractured, and clans turned on each other in brutal conflicts. By the time Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived in 1722, the island was a shell of its former self, its people starving, its culture in ruins. The tragedy of Rapa Nui isn't just about ecological collapse. It's about how quickly prosperity can unravel when a society fails to recognize its limits. The moai, some weighing over 80 tons, kept growing in size and grandeur even as resources dwindled, a haunting symbol of pride outpacing practicality. Today, their hollow eyes seem to ask, what good are monuments if there's no one left to remember what they stood for? Yet there's another layer to this story. Recent research suggests the Rapa Nui may have been more resilient than we thought. Evidence of innovative farming techniques, like using volcanic rock to enrich soil, hints at a people desperately adapting, not blindly failing. Perhaps their downfall wasn't inevitable, but a slow-motion tragedy of small choices adding up. That's what makes Rapa Nui's legacy so chillingly relevant. In a world facing climate change and resource scarcity, their story is a mirror. How do we balance ambition with sustainability? When does cultural pride become dangerous stubbornness? The moai don't offer answers, only a silent challenge, carved in stone, for us to decipher before it's too late. High in the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, where the desert sun bakes the rocks into shades of burnt orange and deep red, stand the silent remains of a civilization that vanished into thin air. These are the dwellings of the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, a name that means ancient enemies in Navajo, though their true story is far more complex than any label could capture. Their cliffside cities, like those at Mesa Verde, are marvels of engineering and artistry, built into alcoves hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. These weren't just homes, they were fortresses, sanctuaries, and communal hubs, all woven into the very bones of the earth. For centuries, the Anasazi thrived in this harsh landscape. They mastered dry land farming, coaxing corn, beans, and squash from the parched soil with intricate irrigation systems. Their pottery, adorned with bold black on white designs, speaks of a culture rich in symbolism and skill. Then, around the late 13th century, something shifted. The great houses emptied. The kiva's ceremonial chambers, dug deep into the ground, fell silent. By 1300, the cliffs were abandoned, leaving behind only echoes in the form of handprints pressed into mortar and cryptic petroglyphs carved into stone. What could drive an entire people to walk away from everything they'd built? Theories abound, but answers remain elusive. Some point to the Great Drought, a devastating dry spell that gripped the region for decades, withering crops and draining water sources. Others suggest internal strife. Signs of violence in some ruins hint at social unraveling, perhaps fueled by competition for dwindling resources. Then there's the spiritual angle. Did the Anasazi leave because the land itself, once sacred, had become a place of broken promises? The most compelling clue might lie in the roads. Across the southwest, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of miles of carefully constructed pathways, some stretching 30 feet wide, cutting arrows straight through rugged terrain. These weren't trade routes, they were spiritual highways connecting sacred sites and pilgrimage centers. When the Anasazi departed, they didn't scatter randomly. They followed these roads, migrating to places like the Hopi Mesas and the Pueblos along the Rio Grande. Their descendants still live there today, carrying forward traditions that stretch back millennia. Yet the mystery lingers. Why abandon the cliffs at all? Perhaps the answer isn't in any single catastrophe, but in a web of pressures, environmental, social, spiritual, that made staying untenable. The Anasazi didn't vanish, they adapted, as all great civilizations must. Their story isn't one of failure, but of resilience, a reminder that sometimes survival means walking away from the very walls that once kept you safe. Standing in the shadow of Mesa Verde's silent palaces, it's impossible not to wonder, what would it take for us to leave our cities behind? In an age of climate crises and social fractures, the Anasazi's choice feels less like ancient history and more like a mirror, reflecting the fragile balance between permanence and change. Their ruins whisper a question we're still learning to answer. When does holding on become the greatest risk of all? In the rugged highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, the kingdom of Axum rose like a beacon of power and sophistication, its influence stretching across continents. At its peak between the 1st and 7th centuries, this wasn't just another African empire, it was a global player, minting its own gold, silver, and bronze coins embossed with the faces of its kings, a rarity in the ancient world. These coins didn't just circulate locally, they turned up as far away as India and the Mediterranean, proof of Axum's sprawling trade networks. And then there were the obelisks, towering stone monuments, some reaching over 100 feet high, carved with intricate false doors and windows, as if they were skyscrapers for the afterlife. These stelae weren't just tombstones, they were declarations of a civilization that could bend stone and gravity to its will. Axum's wealth came from its mastery of trade. Positioned between the Red Sea and the Nile, it became the middleman for spices from India, ivory from Africa, and silks from China. Its port city of Adulis buzzed with merchants speaking a dozen languages, their ships laden with goods that would end up on Roman dinner tables or in Persian palaces. The kingdom even had its own writing system, Jaz, and a unique architectural style blending African, Arabian, and Greco-Roman influences. This was a society that didn't just participate in the global economy, it helped shape it. Yet by the 8th century, Axum's glory had faded. The obelisk still stood, but the bustling markets grew quiet. What went wrong? Some scholars point to climate change. Tree rings and sediment cores suggest the region suffered prolonged droughts, withering the farmlands that fed Axum's cities. Others argue it was the rise of Islam that shifted trade routes away from the Red Sea, leaving Axum stranded like a ship on a receding tide. There's evidence of political strife, too, succession disputes and regional rebellions that fractured the kingdom from within. But perhaps the most haunting theory is that Axum's very success sowed the seeds of its decline. Its wealth depended on a fragile web of trade, and when that web unraveled, the kingdom had no backup plan. The people retreated into the highlands, their descendants becoming the farmers and priests of the Ethiopian plateau. The stelae, though, remained silent and enigmatic, their shadows stretching across the centuries like unanswered questions. Axum's story isn't just about collapse, it's about the precariousness of interconnectedness. In a world where economies rise and fall on the whims of distant markets, where a drought in one hemisphere can trigger famine in another, their legacy feels unnervingly modern. Those towering obelisks don't just mark graves, they're monuments to a truth we're still grappling with today. No civilization, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, is immune to the tides of change. And sometimes the very things that lift a kingdom to greatness can also pull it under. Beneath the towering spires of Angkor Wat, where stone carvings depict celestial dances and epic battles, lies the ghost of an empire that once ruled Southeast Asia. The Khmer Empire wasn't just powerful, it was a marvel of engineering, its capital city Angkor sprawling across nearly 400 square miles, larger than modern-day New York. At its height in the 12th century, this was a place where reservoirs stretched as far as the eye could see, where intricate canals fed rice paddies that could harvest 3 crops a year, and where temples like Angkor Wat served as both spiritual centers and astronomical observatories. The Khmers didn't just adapt to their environment, they reshaped it, turning monsoon-driven jungles into a hydraulic masterpiece. Yet this very ingenuity may have spelled their doom. The empire's lifeblood was water, a network of reservoirs, moats, and canals so vast it's often called the hydraulic city. But recent studies of sediment cores reveal a chilling pattern. By the 14th century, the system began to fail. The canals silted up, the reservoirs, once meticulously maintained, became breeding grounds for disease. The Khmers had engineered their landscape too perfectly, leaving no room for flexibility when monsoons grew erratic or droughts lingered. Like a machine with no off switch, their water network couldn't adapt when nature threw a curveball. Then came the cracks in the empire's foundation. The shift from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism in the 13th century wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The new faith decentralized power, weakening the god-king cult that had held the empire together. Meanwhile, rival kingdoms like Ayutthaya began chipping away at Khmer territory, sacking Angkor in 1431. But here's the twist, invasions alone didn't topple the Khmer Empire. Unlike Rome or Constantinople, Angkor wasn't destroyed. It was abandoned, its people gradually migrating to new capitals like Phnom Penh, leaving their stone giants to the jungle. The jungle, in fact, holds the most telling clue. Pollen samples from ancient reservoirs show something unexpected. As the Khmers left, the forest reclaimed the land with startling speed. This wasn't just nature healing, it was proof the empire's collapse wasn't sudden but a slow unraveling. The people didn't vanish, they chose to walk away from a system that no longer served them. Angkor's legacy is a paradox. Its temples stand as monuments to human ambition, yet their very survival hints at the empire's fatal flaw. The Khmer's built for eternity, but eternity demands flexibility. In their quest to control water, they forgot the most crucial lesson. Civilizations, like rivers, must sometimes change course to survive. Today, as climate change reshapes our own world, their story feels less like ancient history and more like a warning etched in stone. For 2 centuries, Japan existed in a world of its own, making a meticulously ordered society where time seemed to stand still. Under the Tokugawa shoguns, the islands became a closed garden, pruning away foreign influences with ruthless precision. The policy known as Sakoku, or closed country, wasn't just about locking doors, it was a deliberate act of self-preservation. After centuries of civil war and the destabilizing influence of European missionaries and traders, the shogunate saw isolation as the only way to maintain control. No Japanese could leave, no foreign ships could dock, except a handful of Dutch traders confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki's harbor. Even books from abroad were banned. The result, a feudal utopia frozen in amber, where samurai codes, tea ceremonies, and woodblock prints flourished untouched by the Industrial Revolution transforming the West. Yet this cultural time capsule came at a cost. While Europe and America raced forward with steam engines and railroads, Japan's military technology stagnated. Its once feared samurai still practiced archery on horseback, unaware that their swords were no match for modern rifles. The shogunate's elaborate spy network, designed to root out dissent, couldn't prepare them for the shock of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships steaming into Edo Bay in 1853. These American warships, powered by coal and armed with cannons, demanded Japan open its ports or face bombardment. The message was clear: the world had changed and isolation was no longer an option. What followed was a collapse as swift as it was inevitable. The shogunate, weakened by corruption and peasant uprisings, scrambled to modernize, but it was too late. Young samurai, disillusioned by their leader's inability to repel the foreigners, rallied behind the cry of "Sono Joy," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. In 1868, the last shogun resigned, and power was restored to the teenage Emperor Meiji, though in truth, it passed to a clique of reformists who understood the brutal new rules of global power. The Meiji Restoration wasn't just a political revolution, it was a cultural earthquake. Within decades, Japan transformed itself from a feudal backwater into an industrial empire, adopting Western technology while fiercely guarding its identity. Factories replaced rice paddies. Samurai traded their katana for suits and briefcases. The very isolation that had preserved Japan's traditions became the fuel for its reinvention, as the nation cherry picked the best of foreign innovations without surrendering its soul. Here lies the paradox of the Tokugawa era. Their isolation was both shield and trap, a policy that protected Japan long enough for it to modernize on its own terms, yet one that nearly doomed it when the outside world came knocking. The shogun's greatest fear had been change, but in the end, it was their inability to change that sealed their fate. The lesson echoes far beyond feudal Japan. No society, no matter how disciplined or insular, can freeze time forever. Adaptation isn't betrayal, it's survival. And sometimes the fiercest walls we build aren't around our borders, but around our minds. The wind howls across the empty fjords of Greenland, where crumbling stone walls stand as the last testament to a people who defied the Arctic for generations. These weren't just any settlers, they were Vikings, the same seafaring warriors who raided Europe and crossed the Atlantic to North America. Yet here, at the edge of the known world, they built something unexpected. A thriving Norse society complete with cathedral-like churches, dairy farms, and even a bishopric. At its peak in the 13th century, Greenland's eastern settlement boasted nearly 4,000 souls, their pastures dotted with grazing sheep and cattle. How did they survive in a land where winter darkness lasts months? The answer lies in their ingenuity and in the fatal miscalculations that would eventually erase them from history. Greenland's Norse didn't just endure the cold, they mastered it. They adapted European farming techniques to the Arctic, using manure to insulate fields and rotating crops to maximize short growing seasons. Their diet was a balancing act: meat from livestock, seal hunts when supplies ran low, and precious imported grains traded for walrus ivory, their most valuable export. But this delicate system depended on two fragile threads: trade with Europe and a climate that for centuries had been unusually warm. Then both began to unravel. The first blow came from the sky. Around the 14th century, the Little Ice Age crept in, shortening summers and expanding glaciers. Sea ice thickened, choking off shipping routes. Meanwhile, Europe's demand for walrus ivory collapsed, replaced by cheaper African elephant ivory brought by Portuguese traders. With no exports, Greenland's settlers couldn't import iron tools, timber, or the grain that supplemented their fragile farms. Starvation loomed, yet archaeological digs reveal something startling. Even as their world contracted, the Norse clung stubbornly to their European identity. They wore woolen tunics instead of adopting the Inuits' warmer sealskin clothing. They kept eating beef long after their cattle herds dwindled, their bones showing signs of malnutrition. Then there's Valsey Church. Its roofless stone walls, still standing after 700 years, frame a haunting scene, the last written record of Greenland's Norse. In 1408, a wedding was held here, recorded in Icelandic annals. After that, silence. No battles, no mass graves, just empty farms and the eerie sense of a people who simply walked away. Some researchers believe the survivors boarded ships for Iceland or Norway, though no records confirm it. Others argue they stayed until the end, their numbers shrinking until the last family died out in a lonely fjord. The truth may lie in the ice itself. Core samples from Greenland's glaciers reveal a grim timeline. As temperatures plummeted, the Norse faced not just cold, but erratic weather, droughts, sudden storms, and unpredictable sea ice that made sealing impossible. Meanwhile, the Inuit, who shared the land but not the Norse's customs, thrived. Their flexible lifestyle, hunting seals, moving with the seasons, proved more resilient than the Norse's fixed farms. Did conflict play a role? A few Norse skeletons show signs of violence, but there's no evidence of large-scale warfare. More likely, the two groups simply coexisted, one fading as the other adapted. Greenland's Norse didn't vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they were stubborn. In a land that demanded flexibility, they doubled down on tradition, refusing to change even when change meant survival. Their story mirrors our own era's climate crises, a warning that no society, no matter how resourceful, can afford to ignore the changing world around it. The stones of Valsey Church don't just mark a wedding, they mark a crossroads, and the choice the Norse failed to make still echoes across the centuries: adapt or disappear. Deep in the emerald heart of Central America, where vines strangle crumbling pyramids and howler monkeys call from the canopy, lie the ruins of a civilization that once rivaled any on Earth. The Maya didn't just build cities, they engineered them, aligning towering temples with the movements of Venus, carving staircases with thousands of glyphs, and constructing reservoirs so precise they could sustain millions. At its peak around 800 AD, their world was a tapestry of rival city-states like Tikal and Calakmul, connected by trade routes stretching from the Caribbean to the Pacific. These weren't just settlements, they were living cosmologies where kings claimed descent from gods and blood rituals ensured the sun would rise again. Then, within a single generation, the heartland emptied. Palink's palaces fell silent. Kapon's sculptors laid down their chisels. By 900 AD, the great cities of the southern lowlands were reclaimed by the jungle, their populations scattered like seeds on the wind. What could make a people walk away from everything they'd built? The answer might lie in the very stones they left behind. Tree rings from ancient cedar logs tell a grim story. The 9th century was a time of relentless drought, decades where rain scarcely touched the limestone plains. For a civilization dependent on seasonal downpours to fill their reservoirs, this wasn't just hardship, it was existential. Yet climate alone doesn't explain the collapse. Glyphs on weathered stelae hint at another culprit: war. As resources dwindled, alliances fractured. The same cities that once traded jade and obsidian began raiding each other, their battles recorded in gruesome detail. Captured kings sacrificed atop pyramids, entire lineages erased. At Dos Pilas, archaeologists found mass graves filled with skeletons bearing the marks of violent deaths. But here's the twist: not all Maya cities fell. While the southern heartland crumbled, places like Chichen Itza in the north not only survived, they thrived, adapting with new trade networks and water management techniques. The real mystery isn't why the Maya collapsed, but why some communities endured while others vanished. In the Pook Hills, engineers built choltuns, underground cisterns lined with plaster, to hoard every precious drop of rain. Along the coasts, traders shifted from inland routes to seafaring canoes, tapping into new markets. These weren't just acts of survival, they were reinventions, proof that the Maya weren't a monolith, but a mosaic of cultures responding to crisis in different ways. And then there's the calendar. When the long count cycle ended in 2012, the world held its breath, mistaking poetic symmetry for prophecy. But the Maya never predicted doomsday. Their scribes saw time as cyclical, endings always birthing new beginnings. Today, over 6 million descendants still speak Mayan languages, still tend milpa fields as their ancestors did, still keep the old stories alive. The jungle may have swallowed their cities, but their legacy whispers through the ceiba trees. Collapse isn't an end, but a crossroads. The real lesson of the Maya isn't in their monuments, but in their resilience, the quiet truth that civilizations don't die. They transform. In the golden savannas of southern Africa, where acacia trees cast long shadows over ancient stone ruins, lies the silent legacy of a kingdom that once commanded wealth beyond imagination. The towering walls of Great Zimbabwe, some reaching over 30 feet high and assembled without mortar, curve like the coils of a serpent around the hilltops, a masterpiece of engineering and ambition. These aren't just ruins, they're the bones of a civilization that thrived on gold, its veins threading through the earth and into the hands of traders from as far away as China and Persia. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, this was the heart of a network that stretched across the Indian Ocean, where ivory, copper, and glass beads changed hands in bustling markets. The kingdom's rulers, seated in stone palaces, wore cloth spun with gold threads, while their subjects built terraces into the hillsides, coaxing crops from the dry soil with ingenious irrigation. But prosperity is fragile, and the very forces that lifted Great Zimbabwe to greatness may have hastened its fall. One theory points to the land itself. Centuries of cattle grazing and firewood harvesting could have stripped the soil bare, turning fertile plains into dust. Archaeologists have found evidence of deforestation, with tree pollen vanishing from sediment layers around the time the city declined. Another clue lies in the trade routes. As Swahili merchants along the coast forged new connections with Arab and Portuguese traders, the gold that once flowed through Zimbabwe may have been rerouted, leaving its economy starved. Then there's the climate. Core samples from nearby lakes suggest a prolonged drought in the 15th century, a death knell for a society already balancing on the edge of sustainability. Yet the most insidious threat might have been internal. The kingdom's power was built on a delicate hierarchy, a divine king, a class of wealthy elites, and a vast labor force. When resources grew scarce, that social contract could have frayed. Some ruins show signs of burning, hinting at unrest or rebellion. Others suggest a quieter exodus as families packed up their grinding stones and moved to smaller, more manageable settlements. By the time Portuguese explorers heard whispers of Simbaya, the stone city was already a ghost, its people scattered, its stories fading into legend. What makes Great Zimbabwe's story so compelling isn't just its collapse, but the myths that grew around it. For centuries, European colonizers refused to believe Africans could have built such wonders, spinning tales of Phoenician or biblical origins. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeology confirmed the truth. This was an entirely African achievement, a testament to ingenuity and adaptation. Those silent walls, once dismissed as enigmas, now stand as proof of a sophisticated society that mastered trade, architecture, and governance long before outsiders arrived. Today, the ruins challenge us to rethink what we know about resilience. Great Zimbabwe didn't vanish because it failed. It evolved, its people adapting to new realities rather than clinging to a crumbling past. The kingdom's descendants, the Shona people, still live in the region, their oral traditions keeping alive the memory of a golden age. The stones may be silent, but their lesson echoes. Civilizations don't end when their walls are abandoned. They end when their stories are forgotten, and in the wind that rustles through the ancient corridors of Great Zimbabwe, those stories still whisper. High in the barren cliffs of western Tibet, where the air is so thin it steals your breath, lie the ruins of a kingdom forgotten by time. The walls of Tsaparang, once painted in hues of crimson and gold, now crumble into the dust of the Himalayas. This was the heart of Guge, a realm so isolated, its people believed they were the last guardians of pure Buddhist teachings. At its height in the 10th century, Guge wasn't just a kingdom, it was a beacon of faith, its monasteries stocked with illuminated manuscripts, its caves adorned with frescoes depicting deities with eyes that seemed to follow you across the room. Pilgrims traveled for months to reach this sacred stronghold, braving avalanches and bandits for a chance to study under its masters. But isolation cuts both ways. Guge's remoteness, which had shielded it from Mongol invasions and political turmoil, also made it vulnerable. By the 17th century, the kingdom's fate hinged on a single lifeline: the trade routes that snaked through the mountains, bringing not just goods, but news of the outside world. When those routes shifted, when caravans found safer paths or bandits made the journey too perilous, Guge's economy withered. The monasteries, once bustling with scribes and scholars, grew quiet. The frescoes, unprotected by the kingdom's dwindling resources, began to flake away in the dry mountain air. Then came the coup de grace. In 1630, a neighboring kingdom, Ladakh, laid siege to Tsaparang. But here's the twist: Guge didn't fall to brute force alone. Legends whisper of betrayal, a royal advisor who opened the gates in exchange for promises of power. Others blame a natural disaster. Earthquakes are common in the region, and one well-placed tremor could have shattered Guge's already fragile defenses. The truth may never be known. What's certain is that by the time the dust settled, Tsaparang was empty, its libraries burned, its murals defaced, the survivors, if there were any, vanished into the high desert, leaving behind only echoes in the wind. Today, climbing to Guge's ruins feels like stepping into a ghost story. The caves still hold fragments of their former glory, a handprint here, a scrap of indigo robe there, but the stories they tell are incomplete. Some murals show scenes of enlightenment, others, battles with horned demons. The most haunting detail, many of the paintings were left unfinished, as if the artist's new time was running out. Guge's legacy isn't just in its ruins, but in the questions it leaves unanswered. How does a civilization so devout, so disciplined, simply disappear? Was it treachery, disaster, or something slower? A gradual forgetting, a turning inward until nothing remained but the cliffs themselves. The silence of Tsaparang offers no easy answers, only a reminder that even the most sacred walls can't keep out change forever. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. Isolation doesn't just preserve. It also conceals until one day, the world looks up and realizes the keepers of the light have vanished without a trace. On the foggy shores of what is now North Carolina, a haunting mystery lingers, one carved into the very bark of history. In 1587, over 100 English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, eager to establish the first permanent English colony in the New World. Among them were men, women, and even children, their hopes as sturdy as the wooden palisade they built around their fledgling village. Governor John White, their leader, sailed back to England for supplies, promising to return within months. But war with Spain delayed him. When he finally made it back in 1590, the settlement was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just a single cryptic clue, the word Croatoan carved into a post and crow etched into a nearby tree. The lost colony had vanished without a trace. What makes Roanoke so chilling isn't just the disappearance, it's the eerie normalcy left behind. Houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, as if the colonists intended to move. Personal items like armor and tools were missing, suggesting a planned departure. But why carve Croatoan? That name referred to both a nearby island and the Native American tribe living there, allies who'd traded with the settlers. Some believe the colonists, starving and desperate, integrated with the Croatoan people. Fragments of European artifacts have been found on Hatteras Island, where the tribe lived, including a 16th century signet ring and pieces of English pottery. Oral traditions among the Lumbee people, descendants of the Croatoan, even speak of white ancestors who joined their communities long ago. Yet not all clues point to peaceful assimilation. A second group of settlers, arriving years later, reported eerie sights: smoke rising inland, lights flickering in the forest as if someone was signaling. Nearby, they found the bones of a single Englishman, half buried near the ruins of a Native American village. Was he the last holdout killed in a conflict, or had the colonists split into factions, some seeking refuge with the Croatoan while others met a darker fate? The Powhatan Confederacy, enemies of the Croatoan, later claimed to have attacked white settlers in the region, though their accounts are vague, the most unsettling theory. That Roanoke's colonists became pawns in a larger game. Spanish records from the era mention rumors of English settlers being captured and taken to Mexico, perhaps as slaves or bargaining chips. Others speculate they attempted to sail home in makeshift boats, vanishing into the Atlantic's merciless waves. But the lack of physical evidence leaves room for wilder theories, from supernatural abductions to secret relocations orchestrated by shadowy figures. Roanoke's legacy isn't just a historical cold case, it's a mirror. Like the isolated kingdoms we've explored, the colony's fate hinged on fragile connections. Cut off from England, surrounded by unfamiliar landscapes and shifting alliances, they faced the same dilemma: adapt or perish. Their story, unfinished and enigmatic, reminds us that isolation doesn't just test survival skills, it tests the very bonds that hold a community together. The word Croatoan endures not as an answer but as a question. When the walls of the known world close in, which paths remain? And how many of those paths lead not to salvation but to silence? Beneath the sun-baked plains of modern-day Pakistan and India, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa whisper secrets of a civilization that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia in sophistication yet vanished without leaving a single deciphered word behind. These weren't just cities, they were masterclasses in urban design with grid-patterned streets, advanced drainage systems, and homes equipped with indoor plumbing, all built over 4,000 years ago. The Indus Valley people didn't just adapt to their environment, they engineered it, channeling the mighty Indus River's floods into a network of canals that fed their crops and filled their baths. Their artifacts, intricate seals carved with unicorns and script, delicate beads traded as far as Mesopotamia, hint at a society both artistic and interconnected. Then, around 1900 BCE, the lights began to flicker out. The meticulously laid streets of Mohenjo-Daro show layers of silt, suggesting catastrophic flooding. At Harappa, skeletons litter the ground, some clustered in groups as if fleeing sudden violence. Yet the most chilling detail is what's missing. No grand monuments to war, no cuneiform tablets blaming invaders. Just silence. So what happened? The river holds the first clue. Sediment cores reveal the Indus once shifted its course dramatically, stranding cities that relied on its water for survival. Droughts followed, withering crops and emptying granaries. But climate alone doesn't explain the broken seals and abandoned workshops. Some archaeologists point to the arrival of the Indo-Aryans, whose horse-drawn chariots and Vedic hymns later dominated the region. Yet there's no smoking gun, no burned temples or mass graves to confirm an invasion. The truth might lie in the civilization's greatest strength, its unity. Indus Valley cities shared standardized weights, bricks, and even street layouts across hundreds of miles, a feat requiring tight coordination. When floods and droughts disrupted trade routes, this interconnectedness may have backfired. Like dominoes, one city's collapse could have triggered others until the entire system unraveled. But here's the twist: the Indus people didn't just disappear. Recent excavations show their culture lingered in smaller villages, their pottery styles and rituals evolving slowly. The script faded, but their legacy seeped into later Indian civilizations, like a river sinking underground only to resurface downstream. Standing in Mohenjo-Daro's silent streets, you're left with a puzzle wrapped in dust. A civilization advanced enough to dream of indoor toilets, but unable to leave us a single deciphered sentence. Their end wasn't dramatic, just a slow dimming like embers cooling in a hearth, and perhaps that's the most haunting lesson. Even the most brilliant societies are just one drought, one flood, one shifting river away from becoming whispers in the wind. Hidden in the misty highlands of Sri Lanka, the Kingdom of Kandy was a fortress of tradition, a realm so stubbornly independent, it outlasted every other kingdom on the island. While coastal Sri Lanka fell first to the Portuguese, then the Dutch, Kandy's mountain stronghold remained untouched, its kings ruling from a palace surrounded by emerald forests and guarded by monsoon-fed moats. For over 2 centuries, this was a place where elephants carried royalty through torchlit processions, where Buddhist temples stored sacred relics, and where European envoys were forced to kneel barefoot before the throne. But in 1815, the impossible happened. The last king, Sri Vikrama Rajasinha, was captured by the British, his throne room stripped of its treasures, his people absorbed into an empire that spanned the globe. How did this ancient kingdom, which had defied invaders for generations, finally fall? The answer lies not in a single battle, but in a web of betrayal, missed opportunities, and the relentless tide of change. Kandy's greatest strength had always been its isolation. Nestled in the island's rugged interior, its capital was shielded by steep cliffs, dense jungles, and a network of narrow passes that turned into death traps for invading armies. The Portuguese learned this the hard way in the 16th century, when their forces were ambushed and annihilated by Kandyan guerrillas. The Dutch fared no better, their cannons useless in the tangled terrain, their supply lines stretched to breaking point. But by the early 19th century, the world had shifted. The British, fresh from conquering India, brought more than just muskets, they brought a new way of war. They mapped the highlands, bribed local chieftains, and exploited a growing rift between the king and his own nobles. Here's where the story twists. Sri Vikrama Rajasin, who wasn't just fighting the British, he was fighting his legacy. A South Indian from the Nayak dynasty, he'd inherited a throne simmering with resentment. His heavy taxes and brutal punishments alienated the Buddhist clergy and aristocratic families who'd long been the kingdom's backbone. When the British offered these disgruntled elites a deal, protection and privilege in exchange for surrender, many saw an escape hatch. The betrayal was swift. In February 1815, Kandyan chiefs secretly signed the Kandyan Convention, pledging allegiance to the British crown. By the time the king realized what was happening, his own guards had turned against him. Captured while hiding in a temple, he was exiled to India, where he died decades later, a prisoner in a foreign land. But what if Kandy had adapted? The kingdom's downfall wasn't just about treachery, it was about timing. For years, Kandyan diplomats had watched as the British transformed neighboring India with railroads, factories, and modern armies. Yet instead of reforming, the kingdom clung to medieval traditions, its courtiers dismissing muskets as unworthy of noble warriors. Even as British agents infiltrated the highlands, the king's inner circle debated astrology and protocol, blind to the storm gathering around them. The ruins of Kandy's royal palace tell a silent tale. The British repurposed its halls into administrative offices, its temple of the sacred tooth relic becoming a tourist curiosity. Yet in the countryside, echoes of the old kingdom lingered. Rebellions flared for decades, led by monks and farmers who refused to accept foreign rule. Today, Kandy's legacy lives on in Sri Lanka's cultural heart. Its dances, its rituals, its unbroken Buddhist lineage. But the lesson of its collapse echoes far beyond the island. Isolation can shield a kingdom, but without adaptation, even the mightiest fortresses become museums. The British didn't just defeat Kandy, they outthought it. And in that struggle between tradition and transformation lies a warning for every civilization. The past is a sanctuary, but never a strategy. North Sentinel Island rises from the Bay of Bengal like a forbidden fortress, its dense mangrove forest shielding one of humanity's last untouched societies. The Sentinelese have repelled outsiders for centuries, arrows flying toward helicopters, spears aimed at boats that drift too close to their shores. Their isolation isn't accidental. It's a deliberate defiance, a refusal to engage with a world that has brought disease, exploitation, and destruction to so many indigenous peoples. Unlike the vanished kingdoms we've explored, the Sentinelese aren't relics of the past. They're a living civilization actively writing their own story, one that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress, preservation, and the ethics of contact. What makes their resistance so extraordinary is the sheer consistency of it. In 1867, an Indian merchant ship wrecked on the island's reefs. The survivors barely escaped after days of attacks. In 1974, a National Geographic film crew attempted contact, leaving gifts of coconuts and toys only to be met with arrows that pierced the director's thigh. Even the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami, which devastated nearby islands, saw Sentinelese warriors driving away rescue helicopters with bows drawn. Each encounter follows the same pattern. Outsiders arrive, the Sentinelese defend, and the world retreats, reminded that some doors are meant to stay closed. Yet their isolation hangs by a thread. Poachers lurk in nearby waters, illegally harvesting crab and fish, risking deadly confrontations. Christian missionaries, like the ill-fated John Chow in 2018, have tried to breach the island, believing their faith justifies intrusion. And climate change looms. Rising seas could erode the island's fragile coastline, while warmer waters might disrupt the delicate balance of its ecosystem. The Sentinelese survive not because the modern world has ignored them, but because they've fought fiercely to keep it at bay. Their story isn't just about resistance, it's about rarity. Most uncontacted tribes, from the Amazon to Papua New Guinea, have been impacted by logging, mining, or disease. The Sentinelese stand alone as perhaps the last society entirely untouched by globalization. Their language, their rituals, their social structures all remain mysteries, offering anthropologists a tantalizing glimpse of how humans lived for millennia before agriculture or industry. But that purity comes at a cost. Without exposure to common pathogens, even a single flu virus brought by an outsider could wipe them out, as measles did to the Taino people after Columbus's arrival. The Indian government's hands-off policy, declaring the island a no-go zone, is both a protection and a paradox. By law, no one may come within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel. Drones are banned, fishing is prohibited, but this legal shield also turns the Sentinelese into a spectacle, their existence debated in headlines and documentaries. Is their isolation true autonomy, or are they trapped in a museum of our making? The world watches, torn between romanticizing their noble savage image and acknowledging their right to choose, even if that choice is to tell us all to leave. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Sentinelese isn't about collapse but continuity. While other kingdoms fell to invaders or environmental shifts, they've endured by drawing an uncrossable line. Their arrows aren't just weapons, they're a message, one we're still learning to hear. In an age where every inch of the planet is mapped, exploited, or commodified, their defiance is a mirror. It forces us to ask, does progress always mean expansion? Or is there wisdom in recognizing that some mysteries should remain unsolved, some islands left unclaimed? The waves keep crashing on North Sentinel's shores, carrying away the footprints of those who weren't welcome. And the Sentinelese remain, watching from the trees, their story still untold, because they choose it that way. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse in a single, dramatic moment. It unraveled, thread by thread, over centuries of mounting pressure. At its height, Rome's influence stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, a sprawling network of roads and aqueducts binding together dozens of cultures under one imperial banner. But that very scale became its Achilles heel. The empire grew so vast, so bloated with bureaucracy and dependent on distant frontier armies that it could no longer sustain its own weight. By the 4th century, emperors were no longer crowned in Rome but in distant outposts like Trier or Constantinople, their attention divided between Germanic tribes raiding across the Rhine and Persians threatening the eastern borders. The empire wasn't just fighting enemies at its edges, it was rotting from within. Take corruption, a cancer that spread through every layer of Roman society. Tax collectors extorted provinces dry, pocketing fortunes while farmers starved. senators auctioned off public offices to the highest bidder, turning governance into a profit scheme. Even the military, once the empire's backbone, became a vehicle for opportunism. Generals declared themselves emperor at the slightest hint of instability, leading to 50 years of civil war known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. At one point, 20 different men claimed the throne in just 4 decades, their rival legions bleeding the treasury dry. Meanwhile, inflation spiraled out of control. Emperors debased the silver coinage until a soldier's pay was literally worth less than the metal it was stamped on. The economy didn't collapse overnight. It crumbled like a bridge with too many termites, each bad decision weakening the structure until the whole thing buckled. Then came the barbarians, not as mindless destroyers, but as desperate communities pushed toward Rome's borders by forces beyond their control. The Huns, riding out of the Central Asian steppes, drove Gothic tribes westward in a domino effect of displacement. At first, Rome tried to absorb these groups as allies, settling them in borderlands in exchange for military service. But mistreatment and broken promises bred resentment. In 378, the Goths revolted, slaughtering Emperor Valens and his army at Adrianople. Other tribes followed: Vandals, Suebi, Alemanni, testing a frontier stretched too thin. By 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths sacked Rome itself, looting the city that had stood unbreached for 800 years. Yet the most insidious threat wasn't invasion, but dependency. Rome had outsourced its defense to the very tribes it once fought, relying on Germanic mercenaries to fill its ranks. These foederati, as they were called, had no loyalty to the empire, only to their paymasters. When the money ran out, so did their allegiance. By 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, it was barely a footnote in history. The empire had been hollowed out long before, its institutions eroded by short-term thinking and a failure to adapt. The parallels to today are impossible to ignore. Overextended militaries, economic inequality, institutions corroded by self-interest. Rome's story warns that no civilization is immune to the slow creep of complacency. But there's a crucial difference. The Romans couldn't see the cliff's edge until they were already falling. We still have time to look, to learn, and perhaps to change course. The ruins of the Forum aren't just relics, they're a mirror, reflecting the timeless truth that empires aren't toppled by barbarians alone. They're undone by the choices they refuse to make. Golden spires once pierced the sky above Ayutthaya, their reflections shimmering in the Chao Phraya River as merchant ships from China, Portugal, and Persia crowded its bustling docks. This wasn't just a city, it was a global crossroads where Siamese nobles traded sapphires for Persian carpets and Dutch envoys marveled at gilded temples housing Buddha statues taller than palm trees. For over 4 centuries, Ayutthaya thrived as Southeast Asia's wealthiest kingdom, its labyrinthine canals and floating markets humming with a dozen languages. Then, in 1767, the unthinkable happened. Burmese armies breached its walls, reducing this cosmopolitan marvel to smoldering ruins. The libraries holding centuries of knowledge burned for weeks. Priceless artworks melted into the cobblestones, and the survivors faced an impossible question: how do you rebuild when even the memories are ashes? The sack of Ayutthaya wasn't just destruction, it was cultural erasure. The Burmese didn't just loot, they systematically dismantled symbols of Siamese identity. They beheaded countless Buddha statues, believing this would sever the kingdom's spiritual power. They smashed the intricate stone genealogies tracking royal bloodlines, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct the court's hierarchy. Most devastatingly, they abducted thousands of artisans, musicians, and scholars, stripping Ayutthaya of the very people who could have preserved its traditions. When the smoke cleared, survivors wandered through a corpse of a city where even the rats had fled. Yet from this apocalypse emerged one of history's most remarkable rebirths. The key lay in the river. Just 50 miles downstream, a Siamese general named Taksin rallied the remnants of Ayathea's people at Thornbury. With no time to mourn, they made brutal choices, melting down damaged gold statues to fund new weapons, repurposing salvaged bricks to build fortifications, even recruiting Portuguese mercenaries who'd once been competitors. Within a decade, Taksin's forces pushed the Burmese back and established a new capital at Bangkok. But this wasn't mere relocation, it was resurrection. The new rulers consciously modeled Bangkok's Grand Palace after Ayathea's lost splendor, right down to the iconic prang spires. Craftsmen who'd hidden in rural villages taught younger generations the old techniques, stitch by stitch, chisel stroke by chisel stroke. What's astonishing isn't just that Siam rose again, it's how thoroughly Ayathea's spirit endured. Modern Thai cuisine, from fragrant curries to sweet roti, owes its complexity to recipes salvaged from palace kitchens. The Wai greeting, with its graceful pressed palms, survived because monks preserved etiquette manuscripts in clay jars. Even the kingdom's famed flexibility, its knack for absorbing foreign ideas without losing its core, became Thailand's secret weapon against later colonial threats. Walking through Ayathea's ruins today, you'll see Buddha heads entwined in tree roots, their serene smiles peeking through banyan bark. These haunting fusions of nature and art capture the kingdom's legacy perfectly. The stones may be broken, but the roots remember, and that's the lesson etched into every crumbling wall. Civilizations don't die when their buildings fall. They die when the survivors stop rebuilding. Ayathea's descendants chose to rebuild not just a city, but an unbroken thread of identity stretching across the flames. Deep in the steamy jungles of southern Mexico, where howler monkeys shriek from the canopy and rivers snake through tangled undergrowth, lie the remnants of a civilization so influential, it's been called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. The Olmecs didn't just build cities, they invented the blueprint for everything that followed. Their art, their rituals, even their ball game became the DNA of later powers like the Maya and Aztecs. But their most enduring legacy might be their greatest mystery, the colossal stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons, their faces frozen in expressions that could be grimaces or smiles, staring out from the past as if guarding secrets we'll never fully understand. These heads weren't just sculptures, they were statements. Carved from basalt, dragged 50 miles through swamps without wheels or pack animals, they represented rulers so powerful, their subjects could move mountains in their honor. The Olmecs didn't stop there. They pioneered the first writing system in the Americas, their glyphs etched into jade ornaments and polished mirrors. They built the earliest pyramids, their temples aligned with celestial events. Their traders spanned hundreds of miles, bringing obsidian from the highlands and cacao from the coast. This was a society firing on all cylinders, a cultural supernova. Then, around 400 BCE, the lights went out. What silenced the Olmec heartbeat? The clues are as fragmented as the statues they left behind. At La Venta, their grand ceremonial center, archaeologists found evidence of deliberate destruction, altars smashed, monuments defaced. Was this internal rebellion, a people rising against rulers who demanded too much? Or did invaders from the highlands sack the city, drawn by its wealth? Then there's the land itself. Sediment cores from nearby lakes tell a story of environmental chaos, layers of volcanic ash followed by thick clay, suggesting catastrophic eruptions and flooding. The Olmecs had reshaped their world with canals and terraces, but even the most ingenious engineering can't hold back nature's fury. But here's the twist, the Olmecs didn't exactly vanish. Their influence rippled outward like a stone dropped in water. Maya kings would later claim descent from Olmec ancestors. The Aztecs treasured Olmec artifacts as relics of a golden age. Even the ritual of the ball game, with its rubber balls and stone courts, became a cultural thread tying centuries together. The civilization collapsed, but its ideas became immortal. Standing before one of those colossal heads today, you're struck not just by its size, but by its silence. The Olmecs gave us so much and took their greatest secrets to the grave. Perhaps that's the final lesson of their downfall. Civilizations don't end when their cities fall. They end when we stop learning from them. And those stone faces, weathered but unbroken, seem to whisper that the mother culture's greatest gift wasn't its art or its inventions, but the warning etched into its ruins that no society, no matter how brilliant, is guaranteed forever. Along the sun-scorched banks of the Nile, far south of Egypt's pyramids, rose a kingdom whose ambition burned just as bright. Khmer's rulers built not with stone, but with mud bricks the size of refrigerators, stacking them into towering monuments called Defufa's fortress-like temples that dwarfed everything around them. At its peak around 1500 BCE, this wasn't just some backwater trading post. Khmer was a powerhouse, its artisans crafting gold jewelry finer than anything in Thebes, its archers feared from the Mediterranean to the African interior. Their wealth came from controlling the Nile's southern trade routes, funneling ivory, ebony, and enslaved people northward while keeping Egypt at arm's length. For centuries, the two kingdoms danced around each other, sometimes partners, often rivals, neither able to deliver a knockout blow. Then came Thutmose I. The Egyptian pharaoh, hungry to expand his empire, saw Khmer not as a neighbor but an obstacle. His armies marched south in a brutal campaign, torching palaces, smashing statues of Khmer's lion god Apedemak, and erasing the kingdom's name from monuments. But was this conquest really inevitable? Scrolls from the era hint at a tantalizing alternative: diplomatic letters between the two courts, offers of marriage alliances, even proposals to split the Nile's trade routes peacefully. Khmer's rulers might have saved their kingdom by bending the knee, accepting vassal status under Egypt's sun god. Instead, they chose defiance. The ruins tell a story of that stubborn pride. At Khmer's royal cemetery, archaeologists unearthed mass graves, thousands of bodies buried with their weapons, many showing gruesome battle wounds. These weren't just soldiers, they were men, women, and even children who'd evidently fought to the last breath rather than surrender. Nearby, the tombs of Khmer's kings reveal another clue: sacrificed retainers, buried alive alongside their rulers in grisly displays of loyalty. This was a culture that valued honor above survival, a trait that may have sealed its fate. Yet the most haunting evidence lies in the ashes. At the city's heart, a layer of blackened earth marks where Thutmose's troops burned Khmer's great palace. But dig deeper, and you'll find something extraordinary beneath the destruction. Khmer's architects had designed their buildings to self-destruct. Collapsible pillars, hidden channels of flammable resin. Features suggesting they'd rather reduce their capital to rubble than let Egypt claim it intact. Even in defeat, they controlled the narrative. Today, Khmer's legacy lingers in Sudan's red earth. The Defufas still stand, their staircases leading nowhere, their chambers silent. But their message echoes across millennia. Some kingdoms would rather vanish than kneel. In the end, Khmer's rulers understood what so many forgotten empires did not: that survival isn't the only measure of greatness. Sometimes how you fall matters just as much as how long you stood. High in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, where the wind howls through narrow mountain passes, the walls of Hattusa still stand, silent witnesses to an empire that once commanded the secrets of iron. The Hittites didn't just wield this metal, they revolutionized warfare with it, crafting weapons stronger and sharper than the bronze blades of their rivals. Their chariots, lighter and faster than anything the ancient world had seen, became the tanks of their era, rolling across battlefields from Egypt to Mesopotamia. At its peak in the 14th century BCE, the Hittite Empire was a diplomatic powerhouse, its royal archives filled with correspondence on clay tablets, treaties, marriage alliances, even a famous peace pact with Egypt after the stalemate at Kadesh, one of history's first recorded battles. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a sophisticated state with laws, trade networks, and a pantheon of gods worshipped in massive stone temples. Then, almost overnight, the lights went out. By 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned, its grand gates left open, its temples stripped of treasures. The tablets stopped mid-sentence as if the scribes had fled in haste. What could topple such a powerhouse? The suspects line up like shadows in a torchlit corridor. First, the so-called Sea People's mysterious marauders who ravaged coastal cities across the Mediterranean. Hittite records speak of enemies from the sea, but were they the cause or just one symptom of a larger collapse? Then there's the climate. Tree rings from Anatolia reveal a punishing drought around 1200 BCE, a dry spell so severe it would have withered crops and emptied granaries. Starving populations don't make loyal subjects, they rebel. But the most intriguing clues lie in those scattered tablets. Some describe a bitter civil war between rival branches of the royal family, a fracture that split the empire's heart. Others mention a plague so devastating it's referred to as the hand of the storm god. Could disease have decimated the army, leaving the borders undefended? Or was it a perfect storm, drought weakening the state, rebellion fracturing unity, and invaders exploiting the chaos? The Hittites didn't vanish entirely. Their culture lived on in smaller Neo-Hittite states, their gods and traditions blending into those of later Anatolian peoples. But their imperial might was gone, their capital left to crumble until archaeologists unearthed its secrets millennia later. Walking through Hattusa's ruins today, you can almost hear the echoes of a chilling lesson. Even the most advanced societies are fragile. Mastery of iron won battles, but it couldn't forge resilience against a world unraveling. The Hittites' end wasn't a single catastrophe, it was a symphony of disasters, each note a warning about the delicate balance that holds empires together. And in those broken tablets, we find not just their story, but a mirror to our own age of upheaval. The warm turquoise waters of the Caribbean once cradled a civilization as vibrant as the coral reefs beneath its waves. The Taino people didn't just inhabit these islands, they shaped them, carving ball courts into limestone, weaving hammocks between palm trees, and painting petroglyphs of Khmer frogs that still watch silently from cave walls. Their world was a carefully balanced web of fishing villages and cassava farms, of ceremonial plazas where Beti games united rival chiefs, and of Zemi spirits woven into every aspect of life. Unlike the vast empires of the mainland, the Taino flourished in decentralized harmony, their canoes stitching together a constellation of islands without the need for conquest. Then came the sails. When Columbus landed on Guanahani in 1492, he didn't just bring ships, he brought invisible invaders. Smallpox, measles, and influenza raced ahead of the conquistadors, viruses meeting a population with zero immunity. Within 2 years, entire villages stood empty, their communal bohios collapsing onto floors littered with skeletons. The diseases moved so fast that some Taino died believing the newcomers were supernatural beings unleashing divine punishment. But the true horror was only beginning. Spanish gold fever transformed the islands into charnel houses. The encomienda system enslaved the Taino to mine rivers and plant sugar under whips and branding irons. Resistance brought brutal reprisals at Kaionau. soldiers massacred hundreds gathered peacefully in a square, their blood staining the same stones where ball games once celebrated life. Suicide became epidemic, with families drinking cassava poison rather than endure torture. By 1520, the Taino population had collapsed from potentially millions to fewer than 30,000. A culture that had weathered hurricanes for centuries was erased in a single generation. Yet the Taino didn't vanish completely. Modern genetic studies reveal their lineage lives on, not just in Puerto Rico and Cuba, but in surprising places like Florida and Louisiana, where survivors fled or were trafficked. Their words hurricane, hammock, barbecue still shape our language. More hauntingly, their agricultural wisdom persists in the Three Sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash that now feed millions. The tragedy of the Taino isn't just about destruction. It's about how much was nearly lost before the world could learn from them. Standing on the beaches where Taino fishermen once cast nets, their absence feels like a warning written in salt and wind. Their story forces us to ask, what does it mean to discover a place that was never lost, and how many other voices have been silenced before they could share their wisdom? The waves still kiss the shore where their canoes landed, but the songs that once greeted the sunrise are now just echoes in the ruins. Deep in the misty valleys of ancient Japan, where the forests grow so thick they swallow sunlight, a queen once ruled a kingdom no map can confirm. The legends speak of Yamatai, a land of shaman kings and shadowy borders, where Queen Himiko commanded not just armies but spirits. Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century describe her as a recluse who governed through sorcery, emerging only for rituals clad in robes that shimmered like dragonfly wings. She sent envoys bearing mirrors and swords to the Chinese court, gifts meant to dazzle, or perhaps to distract from how little outsiders truly knew about her realm. For all its vivid descriptions, Yamatai's location remains one of history's most tantalizing riddles. Was it nestled in the rice paddies of Kyushu, hidden among the volcanic peaks of the Kinki region, or lost entirely to the tides of myth? The debate over Yamatai's existence isn't just academic, it's a window into how isolation rewrites history. Unlike Egypt's hieroglyphs or Rome's marble inscriptions, early Japan left no written records of its own from this era. Everything we know comes filtered through Chinese scribes, whose accounts oscillate between meticulous trade logs and fantastical hearsay. They describe Yamatai as a place where time moved differently, where courtiers divined the future by cracking deer bones over fire, and where Himiko's death sparked such chaos that 1,000 attendants were sacrificed to calm the gods. But without physical evidence, these details float between fact and folklore, untethered by ruins or artifacts. Archaeology only deepens the mystery. In northern Kyushu, excavations have uncovered massive 3rd century burial mounds, keyhole-shaped coffin, that match Chinese descriptions of Yamatai's royal tombs. Yet these sites contain no inscriptions naming Himiko, no mirrors bearing her seal. Meanwhile, in the Yamato region near Nara, later Japanese chronicles place the roots of their imperial line, suggesting a competing claim to Yamatai's legacy. The truth might lie somewhere in between, a reminder that kingdoms aren't always places but ideas, shifting alliances of villages and clans that historians later package into neat narratives. What makes Yamatai's vanishing act so haunting is how it mirrors Japan's own relationship with isolation. Himiko's reign coincided with Japan's deliberate turn inward, a cultural cocooning that preserved traditions but obscured origins. Later emperors, keen to legitimize their rule, may have erased or co-opted her story, leaving only fragments for us to piece together. The irony is palpable. A queen who wielded secrecy as power became a victim of it, her kingdom dissolving into the very mist she once commanded. Today, the search for Yamatai feels less about pinning a location on a map and more about grappling with the nature of history itself. How much of the past is lost simply because no one wrote it down, or because those who did had agendas of their own? The silence surrounding Himiko's realm whispers a provocative truth. Sometimes, the most powerful kingdoms aren't the ones that endure in stone, but those that live on as questions, daring us to keep looking. At the dizzying altitude of 12,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin enough to make even breathing feel like a struggle, the ruins of Tiwanaku defy logic. How did a civilization with no draft animals, no iron tools, and no written language construct gateways from single blocks of stone weighing over 10 tons? Their architecture isn't just impressive, it's alien in its precision, with joints so tight you can't slip a razor blade between them. For 6 centuries, from 400 to 1000 CE, this was the beating heart of the Andes, a spiritual and political hub where pilgrims gathered beneath the gaze of the sun gate's carved deity. Then, abruptly, the city emptied. The Grand Plaza, once thrumming with ceremonies, fell silent. The intricate irrigation canals that turned barren Altiplano into fertile farmland choked with dust. What could bring down a society that had mastered the art of surviving where nature seemed determined to thwart them? The evidence points to a slow unraveling rather than a single catastrophe. Core samples from nearby Lake Titicaca reveal a devastating drought in the 10th century decades where rainfall dwindled to a trickle. For a civilization that depended on raised field agriculture, a technique requiring precise water management, this wasn't just hardship, it was sabotage. Imagine entire fields of quinoa and potatoes withering under a sun that grew harsher each year, storehouses emptying as hunger gnawed at the social order. But climate alone doesn't explain the scorch marks found on Tiwanaku's temples or the smashed fragments of its once sacred monoliths. Something more visceral was at work: rebellion. Archaeologists have uncovered grisly clues, mass graves filled with skeletons bearing blunt force trauma, their bones tangled together as if dumped in haste. These weren't invaders' victims, they were Tiwanaku's own elite, their skulls crushed by the very stone tools their subjects had once wielded in service to the empire. The hierarchy that had sustained the city for generations became its undoing. When the rains failed, the priest's promises rang hollow. When the stores ran empty, the laborers asked why the rulers still feasted. The social contract shattered, and with it, the collective will to maintain the canals and terraces that had made life possible at the roof of the world. Yet the most haunting lesson of Tiwanaku isn't in its fall, but in what survived. Centuries later, the Inca would marvel at these ruins, adopting their building techniques and even claiming kinship with their builders. The Spanish, too, would puzzle over the Sun Gate, unable to fathom how primitive hands had carved something so perfect. Tiwanaku's people may have scattered, but their stones refused to forget. In a land where earthquakes topple modern buildings, their walls still stand plumb, their corners still meet at razor-sharp angles. The empire's legacy whispers a paradox. Sometimes, the most enduring monuments are built by civilizations that couldn't endure themselves. And perhaps that's the irony etched into every block. The surest way to cheat oblivion isn't to outlast the centuries, but to build something even time can't erase. From the icy cliffs of Greenland's Norse settlements to the vine-choked pyramids of the Maya, these lost kingdoms paint a paradox as enduring as their ruins. Isolation gave them life, allowing cultures to flourish untouched, innovations to bloom without interference, identities to harden like pottery in a kiln. Yet that same seclusion became their undoing, leaving them brittle when the winds of change began to howl. The Sentinelese draw arrows against helicopters, the Tokugawa shoguns burned foreign books, and the Greenlanders clung to woolen tunics as frostbite crept in, each a testament to the double-edged nature of cutting oneself off from the world. But these stories aren't just about collapse, they're about choice. The Khmer engineers who redirected rivers until their canals silted over, the Rapa Nui chiefs who kept carving moa as forests vanished. They reveal a universal truth: civilizations don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they confuse tradition with trapdoors, mistaking the familiar for the eternal. Contrast this with the Maya's northern cities, where traders pivoted to coastal routes, or the survivors of Ayutthaya, who rebuilt not just a capital but a legacy in the streets of Bangkok. Adaptation isn't surrender, it's reinvention. What lingers most hauntingly is the silence, the untranslated Indus Valley script, the Olmec heads with lips forever sealed, the Hittite tablets broken mid-sentence. They whisper that history isn't just written by the victors, but by those willing to etch their stories in something sturdier than parchment. The lesson isn't that isolation doomed these kingdoms. It's that survival demands knowing when to bar the gates and when to bridge the moat. As notifications ping across continents and algorithms dissolve borders, these ruins ask us, what are we clinging to too tightly? What innovations might we be resisting out of fear rather than wisdom? The past doesn't offer answers, only mirrors, reflecting our own crossroads. So tell me, which of these echoes from the shadows speaks loudest to you? The stubborn Vikings or the pragmatic Meiji, the defiant Khmer or the reinvented Siamese? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep unraveling history's greatest mysteries together. Don't forget to subscribe. The next lost kingdom is waiting.